All right, welcome everyone. We're very excited to have you here. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Stevie Keene, and I am the Senior Director of Content and Creative here at Richardson and Challenger. And we are so excited to have you here for our 30-minute webinar on Ready for Growth, Top Trends for 2025. Before we get started, just a couple quick housekeeping notes. We reserved a little time at the end for Q&A, so please add your questions in the Q&A and in the chat, and we'll be picking a couple to answer at the end. Also, we are recording today's session, and you will be getting the recording and slides in just a few days. So let's go ahead and introduce our team today. All right, our producer is Sarah Doherty. She is our marketing manager here at Richardson and Challenger, and we're very grateful for her expertise today. I am your host. I introduced myself a few minutes ago, and we are delighted to welcome John Elsey, the CEO and president of Richardson and Challenger. John has extensive experience as a senior executive and sales leader at private and public companies across the globe. For more than 20 years, John has been helping companies get better results from their training experiences so their sales organizations can realize their best performance. He's led Richardson since 2015, and we are delighted to have him lead today's conversation.
Stevie, many thanks and welcome everybody. I'm very excited to share with you some of the key trends that we've seen in the field of sales and sales enablement based on the work that we're doing with customers around the world. So without further ado, I suggest we get started. Let's take a look at trend number one, driving seller effectiveness by leveraging the use of generative AI. So no surprise, AI made it to the top of our trend list. AI adoption continues to grow. There's no doubt about it. In fact, estimates suggest that in Q3 of 2024, spending on AI represented somewhere between 16 and 20% of real GDP growth in the United States. And virtually every company that we talk to across a variety of different industry sectors is really asking us themselves the same question. How do I apply this new emerging technology into my own environment and ultimately accrue value? And leaders in sales and sales enablement are asking the very same question. So I'm going to kick us off today by asking for your input with a quick poll. So using the poll functionality in Zoom, you should have that up on your screen. Please select a response that best represents your current situation. So what is your organization's maturity in applying AI specifically within your sales environment? I'm not using it at all. We've experimented with consumer GPTs to support efficiency. We've worked it into many of our workflows to see impact on our revenue. And then finally, we fully adopted it as part of our sales technology stack. Okay, I'll give it one more minute for the results to come through. And I think it's interesting, you see a fairly close grouping. Either we're not using it at all, or we've experimented with consumer GPTs to support efficiency. And that's very much what we're hearing from our conversations with customers around the world. What we've actually seen and what we've seen today is that when we look at the application of generative AI within the sales environment, much of the conversation has so far centered on this concept of how am I driving efficiency? AI can deliver unquestionably exponential gains in efficiency. And when done well, as cited by this McKinsey study we have listed here, it absolutely can contribute to top-line growth, improving margin improvement as we look to kind of lean those business processes and ultimately take out some of the payroll costs associated with the work. But as we look forward, increasingly, we expect to see the emergence of sales efficacy, not just efficiency, as an outcome from the application of specifically generative AI within our sales organizations. Our research and the research of third-party analysts like Gartner and Forrester continue to point, I think importantly, to the outsized impact that sales-led customer experience has on shaping buyer decisions. So how can we best use this emerging technology in our GPTs in a way that positively impacts that customer experience? And our view here at Richardson and Challenger is that AI, when trained within a sales methodology, can deliver potentially significant gains, not just on efficiency, but effectiveness. The landscape today is what we're seeing is that the challenge is that when generative AI is applied within a sales environment as a, let's call it a productivity assistant to the sales professional, it risks creating outputs that are incongruous with the other channels we have in play, our live interactions. It creates a potential for not just inconsistencies, but it creates the potential of raising buyer perceptions of inauthenticity. As we look forward, we need to really apply what we've learned over the last few months with GPTs about the importance of the quality of your GPT prompt. And the quality of that prompt ultimately impacts significantly the quality of our GPT output. Poorly constructed prompts result in suboptimal GPT output. So if we want to have an output that not only is relevant and engaging to our prospects and to our customers, but importantly mirrors the tone and the approach we want our sellers to follow, then we need to train our GPTs first and foremost on our sales methodology. And only then can we be assured that we're building experiences that are consistent with our live sales conversations, the digital content that we're putting into the market, and all the other channels that we're putting out there for our customers to consume. In 2025, we need to adopt this mindset that generative AI does offer a potential for the amplification of our customer experience. Importantly, the customer experience that you've chosen to create. And as such, we need to be really intentional about what do we want that experience to be and not leave it to chance that AI is going to model that experience. So just as we do for our own customer-facing human teams, we need to invest in training generative AI to behave the way that we want. And as such, I think, avoid the risk of creating discordant communications that might inadvertently undermine trust with our buyers. So as we transition and look at trend number 2, seller effectiveness is at the root of this trend, and it looks specifically at the way in which sales organizations are approaching learning. Trend number 2, outcome-driven agile learning, really deals with what we're seeing as an organizational pivot to a new and more iterative approach to building seller capability over at scale. For those of you that attended the Gartner CSO conference in the middle of last year, you'll recall that the overarching theme of that conference dealt with this concept of disruption. Many of the speakers spoke about the implications and specifically the challenges associated with pervasive disruption in the market and the increased pace of disruption on sales and sales organizations, and how we need to adjust our strategies if we are to continue to prosper. Following on from the symposium in late 2024, Gartner published a study that looked at organizations that had committed to and invested in this concept of outcome-driven agile learning. These organizations had shifted their approach to learning, replacing what I would characterize as more traditional waterfall methods that were seen to be really too slow to respond to changing pace of needs, to a more agile and iterative approach, an approach around building skills and capability, which we at Richardson and Challenger strongly advocate for. It's an approach that is characterized as enabling continuous development versus kind of event-based or episodic approach. It focuses really on prioritizing the key skills needed for success rather than generalized learning. And it incorporates an approach which it really sought to kind of iteratively close those specific skills gaps in a rapid fashion, recognizing the changing emerging needs in the landscape. And what you see on this slide here is that organizations and enterprises that adopted this approach saw statistically meaningful improvement in their enterprise performance when you're looking at things like revenue growth, margin, and return on asset growth. 1.4 times X when they treated that as their strategic investment. When they then took that and embedded into the workflows versus treating training as something that was away from the job, a 2 times return. And the enterprises in the top quartile of realizing those learning outcomes were 2.7 times more likely to have higher performance than their competitors. So pretty compelling statistics. Let's take a look at what we mean by outcome-driven agile learning. Frequently today, I would characterize the current state of training is often comparatively rigid. Not because we want it to be, but because historically that's been the approach. It's largely event-based, aligned to something like onboarding or the launch of a new key initiative. It's focused a little bit more on the activities a sales professional needs to complete rather than the outcomes we're hoping to accomplish from the learning or the training. In fact, we equate training, which is a finite activity, with learning, which should be an ongoing activity. If we continue to use the software development analogy, the approach is more like a waterfall approach in nature. It's about determining upfront requirements, maybe through a skills assessment, and then building a relatively fixed solution which we deploy at certain blocks of time in the future. And it doesn't inherently allow for this concept of agility. As we look forward, outcome-driven agile learning really, I think, begins with prioritizing and understanding of all the very many skills and behaviors we might want to consider, which behaviors and skills most closely correlate to supporting the commercial outcomes that you want to see within your organization. It emphasizes the use of data to establish early benchmarks, and the approach is inherently fluid in nature, which leads to our 2025 mindset. The most successful organizations will start with business outcomes desired. They'll match the skills and behaviors needed and take an iterative and agile approach to building capability over time in short bursts. The approach needs to reward creating value early and often. And importantly, it's continuous and iterative in nature. So in an inherent design that welcomes change. I'm going to close this trend just by kind of talking a little bit about the characteristics that support this mindset. So for those of you who are thinking about making this shift, I'd encourage you first and foremost to start with defining what good looks like. And what do we mean by that? I think we need to get really, really clear on what are the outcomes that we want to see that most closely align to our specific desired sales strategy based on where our organization is and what we're trying to accomplish. What do we specifically want to see over time? And then we need to develop a unified definition of what good looks like, the outcomes we want to see, and then focus on the limited set of skills and behaviors that are required to support those outcomes. That gets you a start, but then I would encourage you to consider applying what we would characterize as a role-based lens. So refine that starting point by recognizing that the skills needed need to be relevant and consumable to the variety of different selling roles that you have within your organization. And then importantly, it's this concept of connecting metrics to capabilities and capabilities to metrics. So you consider the performance data that matters in terms of understanding the outcomes that you're trying to drive and build relationships between the data and those behaviors so that we can really understand from that performance data the extent to which we're moving the needle. The journey starts then in action by assessing and benchmarking. You need to understand where your sellers are today, benchmark others either inside or outside your organization in similar roles, and start the learning journey not by trying to boil the ocean, but start that learning journey by focusing on the top 3 performance gaps that you've identified. And in doing so, get granular, use modular snackable content. Think about incremental training interventions in short bursts, both live and asynchronous online, so that you layer in and scaffold skills over time. That leads us to trend number 3. The predictive failure point of building capabilities at scale, I think is, well, we've talked about how you get the starting point right and building in, inherent agility and how important that is. But then how do we support and sustain change over time if ultimately we're going to get to the results that we really want? So let's start by defining enablement in this context. And it's about the recognition that after prescribed training, whether that's training on a core methodology or whether it's assigning learning around some of those specific behaviors, we ultimately face this recognition that a sales team is not a homogenous organization. It's made up of hundreds or thousands of individuals, each bringing a different set of professional experiences, learning styles, and intrinsic traits. And if training is going to yield us the results that we need, we must sustain it after that initial impact, that good feel factor. We need to recognize that every seller needs individual support on an ongoing basis, really, in order for us to get to the results that we want. However, how do you do that? How do you address the divergent needs of multiple different people all at once across your organization? This a one size all fits approach to sustainment, where all sellers receive the same kind of sustainment and reinforcement activity, needs to change. And this Gartner survey indicates here that 82% of sales leaders surveyed recognized if we are to deliver the results that we want to see through that sustainment activity, we have to change our results. So quick poll just for 30 seconds. Let's take a pulse check on where you are. How would you describe your organization's approach to post-training sustainment today? It doesn't exist. We just train people and then we ask them to go back to their work. We ask managers to coach. In addition, perhaps to manager coaching, we kind of push asynchronous content out. Or lastly and finally, after assigning training, all sellers receive personalized reinforcement that is relevant to how well their skills are progressing. Well, most of you are grouping around number one and number two, which is very much in line with what we see. And it's not for lack of knowledge. I mean, enablement leaders know that each seller learns differently. They have different needs after training, but historical constraints around time and technology have made it really, if not impossible, to give each and every individual rep that personalized experience after training. Evolving learning and technology, however, has now created that as an opportunity. And the increased availability of performance data allows us to finally address this spectrum of different needs. Typical sales tech stacks have somewhere between 12 plus 15 different applications, all delivering different elements of rich data into our hands. So now, by creating that data model that associates data with the specific behaviors, we can finally understand how individual sellers are progressing on that journey to proficiency and critically allow us to react to those changes. In 2025, we'll see AI recommendation engines harnessing that performance data and moving us away from a one-size-fits-all approach to one where we can finally prescribe individual support to sellers. And it offers, I believe, the promise of exponential gains in performance as sellers no longer see post-training interventions as increasingly divergent from their needs and the issues that they need to address in order to perform in their individual roles. To trend four. Trend four deals with more change to the buying persona, the changing influence of Gen Z buyers. I think it's one that sellers absolutely need to pay attention to. The buying audience has never been static. It has always been changing. 20 years ago, sales was a business of one-to-one interactions almost exclusively. You worked with a buyer, they asked for customer references, you met in person, maybe you perused a few print catalogs and you made a decision. I don't know whether those are the good old days or not. And then things began to change. So by 2014, Forrester found that an average buying group had increased to somewhere between 5 and 7 people, and about a third of your buyers were doing their research online. Within 5 years, that buying group had doubled. And yes, they began their journey on the website, but now a third of them were starting looking at your social media. More than half began consulting third-party review sites. And as this information exploded, sellers began having to navigate this multi-channel buyer journey. Which brings us to 2025. The buying group hasn't grown much more. Gartner suggests occasionally it's up to 20, but now we see the emergence of the Gen Z buyer into the group, and they're making that buying environment more complex because these pandemic era adults are not used to just doing everything online, but they're now relying more on outsiders rather than insiders. They want vendors to be partners and collaborators. We've seen the data. Every single generation relies less upon the sales rep. There's been a kind of slow decline, but the change between millennial and Gen Z has been precipitous, with a 25% decline in terms of their expressed desire to use the sales rep in their buying experiences. They're more focused, certainly, on other issues like ethics and sustainability. But I think what is interestingly is that this is perhaps the first generation that has never experienced the value of working with a sales professional. And yet, what we know to be true is the fact that buyers increasingly express a desire, if those buyers who express a desire to have this kind of rep-free buying experience, the sentiment reported later is that buyers who rely exclusively on the digital channel to make their purchases reported rates of regret that were 2x that of those who had relied exclusively on the rep buying, the rep less, the digital only buying experience. So how should the seller respond to this new Gen Z coming into the buying environments? We know that they trust external influences. We know that they rely upon third-party reviews. Certainly more than they probably do on that to the sales professional. So I would suggest that our mindset needs to be one of co-creation and collaboration around solutions that Gen Z, that really recognizes the approach that Gen Zs prefer to take. In 2025, we need to partner, and for those of you that are in marketing here, I think we need to partner with our colleagues in marketing to truly map out Gen Z's digital buying journey and really understand where Gen Z buyers are, who they are influenced by, and which reviews they read. Sellers absolutely need to get comfortable leaning in and employing social selling strategies of a micro marketer, so that we understand the subjects that Gen Z care about, so that we can share information and reframe their thinking. Ultimately, Gen Zs want to make the best buying decision possible, but they don't want to feel like they're being sold to. So empower your sellers to recalibrate their approach. So to our final trend, understanding buyer motivation to disrupt indecision. Information overload for buyers is nothing new, no question about it. But buyers now today face this concept of insight overload as inexpert sellers shift from product feature dumping to insight dumping. And insight-led selling, when it's not done well, has inadvertently added and contributed to the noise and exacerbated buyer indecision. Sellers need to think much more strategically about how they drive urgency and motivate actions from buyers, and to do so and to break through the noise, they need to be able to address the most immovable hurdles for buyers, this concept of indecision. All of the recent research tells us that, unsurprisingly, 90% of sales interactions have some indecision at play. And if sellers are to overcome the significant threat posed by indecision, then I'd argue that a key focus for them in 2025 is that they need to understand the root causes of indecision. Our sales interactions need not to focus just on the symptoms, but the causes of that indecision. And to do so, I think they can be advantaged by learning the concepts of behavioral science. Buyers ultimately prefer status quo. They choose inaction over disruption. People place emphasis on perceived risks more than on gains. And this is a phenomenon known in behavioral science as prospect theory. And this idea, which earned the researchers the Nobel Prize, asserts that most people, they prioritize decisions that avoid losses over acquiring equivalent gains. So, as risk aversion increases, as buyers get closer and closer to making a decision, we need to think about leveraging our understanding of behavioral science to address concepts like active inertia, where even in an environment that is changing dramatically, and we are in that environment today, organizations tend to stick with established buying patterns because the familiar is safe, or buyer cynicism, where we see particularly Gen Z buyers don't want to be sold to. Understanding behavioral concepts such as social determination theory, it teaches sellers the importance of allowing buyers to be the architects of their own decisions and elevate actions that promote autonomy, relatedness, and competence. So, in summary, sellers should recognize that information overload and risk aversion is a real thing that needs to be overcome. And sales organizations that understand the root causes of motivation and can lean into concepts of behavioral science, I believe can create a competitive edge. Command of concepts like prospect theory equips sellers to address those root causes. So in 2025, teach sellers these concepts and help them not just react, but proactively create interactions that foster the environment that is conducive to sales outcomes. Ultimately, these concepts give you the edge by helping you to both sell to the logic and to the emotion that is inherent in every B2B interaction. Okay, so that concludes our 5 trends for today. Before we dive into questions, I also want to just highlight the fact that for any sales leaders or enablement leaders who are interested, we'd love to invite you to our RevEdge event. We're hosting 2 complimentary events this year in Chicago and in London. It's an opportunity to meet with your peers, and we'll be diving, amongst other things, into some of these topics in a great more detail at those 2 events. Stevie, we have 4 minutes left of our assigned time. I wonder whether there's any questions or feedback that I can address.
Sorry about that. We have a couple questions. So I'm going to start with Steve Lawrence, who noted that he was recently in a large deal that had 20 stakeholders. And so his question is, what are the 3 tips for creating energy and momentum when a key stakeholder or buyer has suddenly gone quiet after a couple months of a healthy pace?
Wow. I don't envy you. 20 buyers in a sales pursuit. That's right up there at the top end of the Gartner research. Yeah, I think we've all encountered that scenario where we have frequent interactions and suddenly your buyer goes quiet. And again, we need to understand the motivations. The good news is you have 19 other people to talk to in that pursuit. And so we really need to understand the disposition of each of those different people who are either influencing or ultimately involved in making that purchasing decision, and leverage the relationships that we've built and the trust that we've established through the buying process for us in order to shed a light on what is going on with that one individual. I know it is not easy, but we talk about these concepts of consensus and collaboration building through through the pursuit process, as well as this concept of what we would characterize as a zipper strategy. So how can you look to within your own organization to align the appropriate levels of seniority within your business and within the prospective customer environment to maybe begin to make those connections up and down the organizational structure and unlock some of that either indecision or that that stalemate that you've reached during the pursuit process. So I think that's an opportunity, if you can't do it by leveraging the relationships you built with other people in the pursuit today, is to look to see whether you can use your executives within your organization to connect to more senior levels within your customer organization and understand the root cause of that status quo.
Okay, thank you, John. We have time for one more question. And our next question comes from Tony, and I'm so sorry, I'm going to try your last name, Nicolaitis. Indecision is a big reason why customers go dark. In this high-tech world, how do you battle indecision in the space of new-to-world tech?
In the space of
I think in the space of sort of like really leading edge technology, tech that's brand new is what he's looking for. Is how do you battle indecision in a really high-tech sort of specialized scenario?
I mean, I think there's two things to think of here. As I say, I go back to my comments earlier, understanding the root cause of indecision and indecision is often, present because we've first and foremost at the outset of a pursuit not done enough job, not a good enough job to articulate the cost of inaction. I think many sales organizations spend a lot of time talking about the promise of if you invest this with us to deliver these types of services, then as a consequence, this is what you can expect to see as your return on investment. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the perceived gain needs to be more than 2x the perception of loss in order for us to move that buyer from inaction to making a decision. And as a consequence, that makes it a very, very high throw. So we really need to quantify pain and articulate the cost of inaction to a buyer at the early stages of a pursuit. Towards the latter stages of the pursuit, other things are happening at play. There's two other things. First and foremost, it is almost the presence of too many choices. And providing more information at that point in time sometimes becomes unhelpful. So we need to distill down and make sense of all that noise and reduce the number of choices for our customers towards the latter stages of a pursuit to make that decision a little easier. And then finally, the fear of messing up really comes into play right at the end there. So we need to put in place strategies to help them make comfortable and confident about their decision. And that may be about iterative incremental purchases. It may be about introductions to third parties who have been in the same situation to get them comfortable that they're not going to mess up as they take that very, very final step at the end of your sales pursuit and their decision-making journey.
All right. Well, thank you, John, and thank you for those insightful questions and for joining us today. That concludes our session. Be sure to follow Richardson and Challenger on LinkedIn, and we will be sending you this presentation and the recording in the next few days. Thanks a lot and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Please get in
John.
touch if you'd like to carry on the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.